Hello friends, welcome back. In this session, we will understand the ethical considerations in NLP and bias mitigation. This is a very important topic for discussion, and when the technological advancement occurs in a rapid manner, there are always concerns related to the same around the ethical implications. NLP has experienced significant growth and advancements in the recent past. Multiple AI engines, you take ChatGPT, Gemini, voice assistants for mobile phones, and applications for machine translation, sentiment analysis, automated text summarization have been on the rise. So the concerns are strongly expressed in terms of unfair, discriminatory, and harmful outcomes. So we are going to discuss that very clearly, and we will understand the types of biases that can come around the NLP applications and how do we mitigate it. That's the target for the session, and it's going to be a very quick session where we will discuss all those. There are four types of biases possible when it comes to NLP. Bias, as the very meaning conveys, is unfair discrimination embedded in the LLMs or the models and the datasets, which can produce the unbalanced, unfair outputs against a certain group or beliefs or perspectives. Before you go deeper into understanding the biases, it's good to know the types of biases: historical, representation, measurement, and algorithmic. These four biases are there, and we will discuss each of them, and we will also understand how do we mitigate all of them very nicely. Let's get into the historical bias first. It is all about the biases present in the data due to the past, that is, historical and social inequalities. This is all about the discriminatory practices, old social norms, previous societal views prevalent during the time of the data collection. The time of the data collection is a very vital component, and that's to be considered. An instance shall be largely helpful here, and I am going to take up a very simple example of women in employment dataset. We are going to assume the historical age-old employment data, that is from 1950s to early 1980s. That was a period where women were not represented in many professional fields due to discriminatory practices and social views or norms. The data set, when you collect from that period, shall certainly have the men dominating the jobs in the market, particularly in the field like engineering, science, or any executive roles. Women were majorly working or commonly found in the teaching and nursing position. So the data collected from this period is a direct representation and reflection of gender bias. If this data is considered for a training, then the model will be trained with the bias. So when you go ahead with that model for taking any hiring decisions, there will be problems. Men being recommended strongly for the technical, engineering, science, and leadership positions. At the same time, if you see women being recommended just for support roles or nursing roles, this is a definite discrimination. This brings huge consequence in the results. Yes, the algorithms which are trained with the biased data shall bring discriminatory results. The stereotypes shall be brought towards in the shortlisting, and most importantly, there will be a gender bias, and qualified women may not get a chance at all because we have bias everywhere. Algorithms decision shall be unfair, and most importantly, it may even become untrustworthy or non-trustworthy, to be concise. So how do we avoid this mishap? How do we go around and cut this mishap? Review and pre-process the data. One can have a look at the data and remove the bias using techniques as debiasing techniques. Incorporation of fairness metrics is a real good option. Consistent and continuous monitoring of the AI engine's output to detect bias, which may arise over a period, is the right approach. And choosing the right data set is a definite good option for us to mitigate this bias. Let's get into the next one. It is the representation bias. The representation bias is all about the presence of unequal representation of different groups in the training data. The major sources for this type of bias are starting with skewed data sources. This will happen when the data sources are predominantly taken from a specific demography or region. So when you take it from a specific demography or region, there will be an obvious representation bias from that region. And selective data collection is the next reason. The data collection, when excluding certain groups or certain perspectives, will create representation bias. And historical inequalities again play a major role here. The prevalence of the societal bias or the inequalities will always have a significant reflection in the data set, and this would cause representation bias. Well, What are all the effects of this bias? Very simple, you still live with the stereotypes. The models trained based on the data which are biased may reinforce negative stereotypes. For an example, this could get poorer results, biased results with respect to jobs. It can be very unfair. Unfair treatments are possible and discriminations can come in terms of hiring, lending and law enforcement. And poor performance for underrepresented group is another major challenge that we will get because of this kind of bias. NLP models may produce inaccurate results or perform poorly for the underrepresented groups in the training data, which certainly leads to very poor results or even erroneous results. The loss of trust is the most important component we need to look into. The AI models have been into this risk where people will start losing trust on that model if the results are biased and if the outcomes are untrustable. So that way we should be very careful. So how do we mitigate this bias? Very simple. We have to mitigate this bias by collection of data from different diverse sources, different geographical regions, different languages, different cultural contexts. That way we will be more inclusive and we can avoid this kind of bias and mitigation can happen there. The next bias in the queue is the measurement bias. If there is bias in the way the data is collected or labeled or measured, measurement bias can definitely arise. The measurement bias will drive the NLP models to arrive with skewed results, making the results totally unreliable. Measurement bias has a direct implication on the performance of NLP and also its fairness. The most common sources are going to be discussed right now. First one is the inconsistent labeling. The annotators may not follow the same guidelines. I annotate, you annotate, X and Y are also annotating. We should follow consistent pattern there, and if we are not following that, there could be bias because of that. The personal bias that I may carry, you may carry, the annotators may carry will also have a strong impact. Sometimes usage of the tools may give you some real bias. Finally, if the data collection methods that you are working on or following have some pitfalls, it will throw huge impact on the data collected. There are multiple effects that are going to come because of measurement bias, and that's going to be similar to the biases that we have dealt earlier, like the historical bias. We have seen that, right? The results are going to be the same. Now the question is, how do we avoid, how do we mitigate measurement bias? Standardized data collection and labeling is the first way to go ahead with it. The data collection and the labeling are to be done in accordance with standard guidelines, and uniformity in labeling is to be definitely established. The annotators are to be provided with proper training to ensure every annotator is on the same page. One can conduct a bias audit and relabeling can be done as required. There are automated tools available for labeling and can be used. Continuous monitoring of the outcome and evaluation of the results shall be very helpful to determine the course of action in case bias is detected. The final type of bias that we are going to learn is the algorithmic bias. It is a systematic and unfair discrimination that occurs due to the algorithms preferred or used in the model development. Algorithmic bias can arise from various stages in the machine learning pipeline, which include the data pre-processing, model training, or deployment. The bias in the data could be a reason for algorithmic bias. The design of the model could be a reason as well. If it favors certain patterns, it will have a direct impact on the result. The way the model has been trained also carries a lot of value. The environment where the model is getting deployed has strong influence too. Algorithmic bias eventually results in the skewed output and can produce unfair or discriminatory outcomes. Importantly, the aspects of reliability and quality of the NLP application will be questionable. When you go ahead with historical biases, you get it from societal inequalities and stereotypes. When you go with representation bias, it comes because of skewed demographic distribution in the data sets. Measurement bias comes from the data collection and the labeling methods. Algorithmic bias comes from model training and decision making process. So we have seen 4 types of biases and the sources and the ways to mitigate it. Now in the next session, we will see what is the impact that these biases bring in NLP applications. Until then, it's thanks from me and I'll see you in the next session. Thank you.